So, what you're telling me is that because of the aggregate and complex nature of Salesforce permissions and the way that entitlements are granted, it's possible that you could face maybe one of two issues. One, a cloning issue where a user ends up with much more elevated rights than were intended, or the other half of it is the aggregate rights of many different entitlements stacked together, granting a user far more elevated rights than I think initially intended. And because of this, it requires constant due diligence and entitlement reviews to make sure that least privilege is maintained in Salesforce. Hey, Ryan, I know we dove into Salesforce entitlements the other week and looked through the interface to see exactly how you would look at some of those profiles and entitlements. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is if we think back in the day with on-prem file servers in the Windows environment, there are a couple defined places that you might want to go to check admin rights. So think your domain admins group in AD, or maybe some of the local admin groups on the machines themselves. Can you tell us what that looks like in the Salesforce world? Because I know it's very much different.
Yeah, Kilian, we talked about this last time, but permissions in Salesforce are fairly sophisticated. And when we think about things like privileged access or admin access, we have to take into account both the object and the field and record level permissions around like the data objects themselves, as well as things like the application or the system level permissions. And all of that can be influenced through the combination of various entitlements that might be given to any particular user, right? The combination of their profile plus any permission sets or permission set groups that are applied to their account. All of that can add up to some sort of elevated permission pretty quickly.
So, in terms of how people are given profiles, what's a common workflow that an organization would go through, for example, if they're setting up their Salesforce environment? And how can that interfere or influence some of the level of rights that people end up with?
Yeah, well, working with organizations, we see an issue that arises from this a lot. So to think about how it works, oftentimes a Salesforce admin or a user within Salesforce, if they're going to create a new profile, let's say, for example, they might start with a pre-existing profile, clone it, change the name, and maybe modify some of the attributes to it, modify the entitlements and the permissions. What sometimes happens and where we tend to see a lot of risk is either that admin or user might start with an already highly privileged profile like the system administrator profile, and they might call it something a little bit less obvious that maybe doesn't necessarily look like an elevated profile. Or on the other hand, they might clone an already custom profile that they may not realize has elevated privileges, like the ability to export reports or make changes to the system, or even in some cases modify all data.
So, in terms of how people would spot this type of maybe, I'm not going to call it a misconfiguration, but elevated rights, how would they go about doing this? What's the process they would go through for identifying it?
I would call it permissions creep or sometimes excessive access. And honestly, this kind of brings us back in the day a little bit, but doing things like routine entitlement reviews, understanding what types of entitlements, profiles, permission sets, permission set groups, the various different entitlements within the Salesforce world are applied to each given user, understand what level of permissions are applied throughout each of these types of entitlements, and then really looking at the aggregate across each one, trying to identify the riskiest permissions first, those highly elevated actions that can be performed, and making sure that we're trying to achieve a least privilege model, right? We're minimizing that access where necessary.
So, what you're telling me is that because of the aggregate and complex nature of Salesforce permissions and the way that entitlements are granted, it's possible that you could face maybe one of two issues. One, a cloning issue where a user ends up with much more elevated rights than were intended, or the other half of it is the aggregate rights of many different entitlements stacked together, granting a user far more elevated rights than I think initially intended. And because of this, it requires constant due diligence and entitlement reviews to make sure that least privilege is maintained in Salesforce.
Spot on.
Awesome.